I'm back again with my friend Randy Kitchur, and let's talk a little bit about our common friend Stan Fulham.
Okay. Stan
First.
Fulham.
Yeah.
Stan Fulham contacted me. This would have been about, let's see, before 2010. This would have been about 2008 or so. I get a call from a person who was very amazingly, like his manners in terms of being a gentleman. He was just unique and on one of the most dignified persons I've ever met in my life. Calls me up. It says he's got a name from some researcher. Said contact Randy Kitchur. Wants to send me a book called Challenges of Change. Stan was an author of a book. He had contacted, trying to get his book promoted in Toronto, contacted a place called Conspiracy Culture, and they said, you want to contact Randy Kitchur in Winnipeg, so he did. Now, give you a bit of a background about Stan, like you don't, just for your audience. Stan, during World War II, was a prisoner of war. He was shot down in Germany, and he was in prisoner of war camp, and when they they would notice UFOs flying above their prisoner of war camp. The period of time went past after the World War ended, and he was working for NORAD in Comox, Port Comox, is it?
Comox,
BC, and one day he gets to work, and the person on duty says to him that there are UFOs over the runway, and Stan says, well, what do you want to do about them? And the guy says, well, I don't know, I was waiting for you. So Stan was the flight control officer. They set jets out to chase after these UFOs, and the UFOs just flew up and disappeared into the atmosphere over the Pacific Ocean. A few weeks later, he gets a visit from people from NORAD headquarters, and they basically, he was first of all thanked for keeping everything quiet because the media was making inquiries. So they thought they could trust him, and he was debriefed by people that were the highest level government officials at the time from NORAD headquarters on UFOs, and he maintained this relationship with this person named Dave for something like 40 years. And so he would get all this information on ETs and ET civilizations, and but he didn't want to write about that because he knew he would get Dave in trouble. So his sister at that time who was actually dying of cancer, said to him, Stan, you're not going to get information about UFOs from this dimension. You have to go to their dimension. And I'm dealing with this deep transchanneler in Ontario called Rick Thurston, and he's amazing. You have to contact him. So Stan was very skeptical, did contact him, and he blew him away. And so information that he could not possibly believe. So he wanted to find out about UFOs. So for about 10 years of his time, he was putting together a series of books, different editions, where he got information on their civilization. And it's put into a book, and it's on our website, Challenges of Change, Google sites, and you'll just find that. And so he made a prediction. Well, actually, after what he had done was he contacted me, and so he sent me the book, and I didn't read it for about 2 weeks, and then I finally decided to pick it up, and I could not put the book down. It was like, oh my God, why didn't I start reading this right away? Yeah. And so I read it in one sitting, and I contacted him. We became very close friends. We would meet all the time. Mostly the Olive Garden was our favorite place to go to.
That was his place. That's where I met him too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I got to know his son, David Fulham, as well too. I worked with his son, David Fulham. Now, Stan had gone to this deep transchanneler who were getting a group called the Transcenders. This ethereal group that's out there. Don't want to get into too deep of a description, but they would give him information. But he had, through his spirit guide, Stan maintained a spirit guide, that there would be a UFO display over the major cities of the world in October 13, 2010. And he verified that through the Transcenders, and he got me to create a website for him, become his spokesman. We put out press releases and everything like that. It came about 2 months before, in July or August, something like that. They changed it. They're just going to do it over New York. And there was a person named Michael Luckman, who's now passed away, who was a researcher in New York City, who was one of the two people we told, and Jeff Peckman, who ran this, who was running on this extraterrestrial initiative in Denver. He wanted this display to be over NORAD headquarters, but they felt that would be too threatening. So there was Jeff Peckman and Mike Luckman that knew it was just going to be over New York on that day. And we had interviews and everything like that, and I wasn't holding out any expectations whatsoever. I didn't think, nope, it's not going to happen, not possible. And that day, I tell people, my phone exploded. It's just from all over the U.S. It's just one phone call after another. I could not get to my messages for 2 days. It's like I had 40, 50, 60 messages on my phone, and when I got to my email 2 days later, I had 600 emails, and it was just crazy. And so we started to do who we're going to do interviews with. And so we decided, well, New York Times wants to do an interview, and Coast to Coast wants to do an interview. So we did on the very first interview was New York Times and Coast to Coast, and he did interviews with a lot of people all over the place. And then he goes on. What's the program? Okay, I forget the name of it. He goes on a radio program that next weekend, and then he makes a prediction for January of 2011. It's going to be over Moscow, and then the later part of the month was going to be over London. I said, Stan, quit while you're ahead. Don't do this, Stan. And so no, definitely for sure it's going to happen. And so what had over the next month or so, he began to get feeling not so well. And then it became evident that he had pancreatic cancer, and he died in I guess it was December 19th or something like that.
So he died very quickly?
Very, very quickly. There was no conspiracy. He had symptoms earlier. They were just misdiagnosed. There was no assassination whatsoever.
Because he's in pretty good shape.
He was in amazing shape.
He looked like Ronald Reagan.
He looked like he was healthy like Ronald Reagan. We would be at the Olive Garden, and we would go to our cars, and he would outpace me. And I'm a fast walker. I'm in good shape, and he would be amazing. He would do rowing, but he was so smart and so nice, and he was like a second father to me in a way. My parents had died just before then, and so he dies, and I'm very depressed. First week of January, I don't see anything in the news media, no displays, nothing, and maybe I have to go to YouTube. And so I go to YouTube, and oh my God, they're just independent sightings all over Moscow, just everywhere, like for weeks. And so I started posting up on the website, and then, okay, well, now it's time for London. But in London, there were not as many. There were some from London, but there was like even a story in the leading newspaper in Israel reported on this as well too, because there was one over the Wailing Wall. That was about the time when you had this object that was hovering over the Dome of the Rock that shoots up into the sky like that. So it was incredible the things that were going on. So I created the website, did all the work there. We sold the book, and then we had a team from Japan come down. They considered it to be their 60-minute equivalent. So they sent a film crew down. We were interviewed here in Winnipeg. It was posted. It's posted on our website. Done very, very well, in fact, but it's all in Japanese, and so it has limited appeal for people. But anyway, that's what Stan was about. So, anything further you'd like to ask?
Who mentioned Putin? Where does Putin come into the
okay,
story?
yeah. This is now. So Stan would ask all kinds of questions about things that are not on the website that he would tell me and other people, and just mountains of information, because it was very expensive to go to this channel. It was like $100 an hour, and it's me. He spent $100,000 to $200,000 over the course of 10 years doing the research, and but he got all kinds of information, and he passed on as much as he could to me. But
did he keep notes of all this stuff? Did he keep?
Here is the saddest part. His wife did not appreciate at all that he was taking $100,000 to $200,000 of the family, and so she made sure that the 2 books that he completed. He actually completed, I think it was a book about UFOs at Atlantis, and then there was a book about these what he called strange aliens, the ones that are not really well known, and they were like 400-page books that he had to pare down to 300 pages and 200, because they were just massive amounts of work in there, and they were on his computer, and I believe it was deliberately that the wife gave away the computer to a cousin, and David, his son, tried to get the computer back, and we could not get the computer back, and so that's all lost to posterity, and it's unfortunate, because there was so much work of his. That's challenging. That's only a third of his work. The other, but it was like there's at least 800 pages of material out there, and I'm sure once a young person gets, you know, they're going to delete all the files and fill it up with all kinds of, iTunes and things like that. It's just going to be, you know, it's just such a tragedy, in fact. But it would have been wonderful to get that information. David did come across a 50-page article that he wrote on a floppy disk, but he misplaced it and he doesn't know where that was. Right? Yeah. So unfortunately, there's nothing more we can get from there. So that's what that's all about. But Stan, like he was accurate. He got New York right. He got Moscow right, and he got London right.
Did he have the connection to Putin? What was the deal?
Okay, now the thing with Putin is he asked Rick Thurston, who was asking these transcenders, how does disclosure come about? And according to the transcenders, it comes about through Vladimir Putin. So any efforts you think are being directed towards the U.S. government, I don't think are going to go anywhere. It's going to be, for whatever reason in the future, through whatever circumstances, and I'm sure I'm looking at Putin as this evil, despicable, malevolent force on the face of the earth who will only utilize this to his own advantage. It won't be for the good of humanity. It'll be to consolidate his power and control over larger sections of the earth, maybe to discredit the Americans, to embarrass them. But the Americans, they did not seize initiative, and according to Stan, through the transcenders, it's going to be Putin, and that's going to be his legacy, and everything is going to be lost. The Americans are going to lose power, prestige, influence in the world. If they're going to do it now, they better do it now, because Putin is, according to Stan, he's the one that's going to be doing it.
Beautiful.
Yeah, my name is Stan Fulham. I live in Winnipeg, Canada. I served in World War II with Bomber Command, which ages me, doesn't it? Or dates me, rather. And I'm now 85, soon to be 86 years of age. And sometimes that is a blessing, and sometimes it creates a bit of a problem because people sometimes will get asked for proof of my birth certificate. Well, however, I did serve during World War II. Yes, after the war, I went to university and traveled around a bit to work for British United Press, and then I returned to the Air Force, and when I did, I flew with Bomber Command during the war, and then when I returned to NORAD, I functioned as a fighter controller, and worked in the radar control business.
Okay, for people that don't really know NORAD, can you explain what happens in a NORAD center, what your role is in terms of North American defense?
NORAD functions through the radar sites, which at that time were placed strategically all around North America. There was the Dew line that covered the Arctic, the Mid-Canada line, and then there were a number of radar sites throughout the United States, especially along the borders. And we worked very closely with the Department of Transport in Canada and the United States. Any aircraft that flew IFR, Instrument Flight Rules, had to inform us of those flights so that our identification section, when we picked up the blips on our radar scope, then we could identify what aircraft that is, where it was going. Say, for example, on the West Coast, we picked up a radar return showing this aircraft flying at about maybe 500 miles an hour, flying in a northwesterly direction towards Alaska, on its way to Alaska, to Japan. And then our identification section would immediately check what information they got from the Department of Transport. And if it jived with the information we had on the setting, the location, the speed, the height, then we could say, fine, that is Japan Airlines 762, this sort of thing. And then the plotting on the radar screen, which is a huge screen, you've probably seen these things, and then the plotters then would change the coloring from red to green, meaning to say it is identified. Now, if, depending upon circumstances, you got to use discretion in these matters. If you plotted some unknowns, and they're quite a fair size, the blips returns are quite a fair size, and they're traveling at great height and speed. Then you got to take different decisions in regards to that. All unknowns then are reported to NORAD High Command, and the senior officer there will decide what he wants to do. And in a lot of cases what we do is that we scrambled our jets. We're on standby 24 hours a day, and they will fly out there and under our control, under the control of the fighter controllers. We bring them out there and they fly side by side with the unknown and communicate with them through radio. Ask them to identify themselves, and if they have, well, then we are notified of that, and that's it.
Okay, so what rank are you when you're working fighter command?
In fighter command, I was a captain at that.
You're a captain, and we talked about an incident with an unidentified in, I believe it was Comox. Can you describe that incident for me?
Well, one night I reported for work at the radar base, and this is on the midnight shift.
And this is Comox, BC on the west coast?
Yeah.
Okay.
And the man I was replacing, the officer I was replacing, told me, he says, there's a couple UFOs hovering at about 2 miles away at the end of the base. We're at the airport. At the end of the base, the fighter squadron was located there. And he says, they've been there for about an hour. I asked him, what did you do about it? And he says, nothing, I'm waiting for you. He says, I figured you'd be able to handle the situation. So they hadn't been reported to NORAD headquarters, which they should have done. So the first thing I thought about it and realized that I had to do something. And so I then told plotters, reported to command. And then a senior officer called me and asked me what was going on. I told him about the UFO sightings that we had, and that I was going to scramble the jets to after them. And he said, fine, keep me informed. I did this. And we had 2 of the fighter jets scramble out, and as soon as they took off, the 2 UFOs, which were very clearly visible, about 2 miles away, they were about 3 times the size of a normal jet fighter, and they were brilliantly lit around the perimeter lights. There were no lights emanating from the top or the bottom, but they just did. And then they suddenly took off, and then they flew south and hovered then over the Pacific Ocean just west of Vancouver. I diverted the fighters to their where the UFOs were located, and when they got within fairly close range, perhaps a couple 3 miles, then the UFOs just took off over the Pacific Ocean. In the morning,
What year are we talking here?
We're talking about the late 50s or around 60s.
Okay,
Yeah.
1960.
So in the morning, at the end of my duty, I completed my report about the incident.
Okay, now where do you send the report?
That report went to my squadron commander.
But it doesn't go to the base. You were telling me it doesn't go to the base.
No, it does not go to the base. The crews, when they could return, they file in their reports to the base.
So the fighter pilots are reporting to the base. You're reporting to NORAD. Okay.
And when I got back home, there was a call from the base commander. And he said, we're getting calls from the media, from Vancouver, Seattle, Victoria, and those places. He says about some strange lights and aircraft that were seen in the sky last night. But he says, as you know, Fulham, he says, there was nothing unusual that happened last night. So there's no reason for us to be speaking to the media. I understood exactly what he said, and I said, I understand, sir. And he said, thank you. A couple, 3 days later, when I talked to my squadron commander, and I told him about the incident, about my conversation with the base commander, and he says, you were wise. He says, because if you had violated what the base commander, the confidentiality that the base commander was requesting of you, that would have been the end of your career.
And okay, so you reported to NORAD. What happens next?
Then, about a couple of weeks later, they call for a meeting with the squadron commander, myself, and the technical officer to discuss this particular incident. I was quite concerned about what would have happened here, because their first reaction is that I've done something wrong, and you go there with that mind concept. However, they were quite pleased with what we had done. However, they wanted to refine the reporting on UFOs about the maneuverability of the aircraft, the lights, the speed, all this. They wanted the reporting to be done in far greater detail. That's what it was all about, and to give them more information about the incident. So they were quite pleased with it. But at that meeting, I met up with a major. There was a colonel there as well.
He was a colonel?
Well, there was a colonel and
Okay,
the major,
okay.
the captain. But so we discussed a number of things. And that evening, I sat down in the bar with the major, and he was a USAF intelligence officer, but was stationed with NORAD.
This is the fellow you refer to as Dave?
I call him Dave.
Okay.
And he told me of a great many things that he knew about relating to the UFO mystery.
Did he refer to your sighting? Did he give you advice based upon what you had seen?
Well, yes. Years later, though, is
Okay.
that when I kept in contact with him.
Okay.
And we didn't discuss this, and I never really discussed this particular incident, but he was telling me about a situation they had in the officers' mess, and I believe it was in one of the NORAD stations. And he said is that the general was telling them, he said he had appeared sometime before to a congressional subcommittee dealing relating to continental defense, including, of course, NORAD. And he said to them, he says, those sons of bitches, referring to the politicians, humiliated me, ridiculed me. He says they insinuated that NORAD officers were suffering from illusions and delusions, that sort of thing. And somebody then mentioned that perhaps if the public were informed about the reality of UFOs, that this would put pressure on the politicians, and then it would help to clear up the air on this matter. And the general said, the public, he said, the public is no wiser than the politicians. He says they are uneducated, they are stupid, they are uninformed, misinformed, and he says, in his view, personally, they're just too fucking stupid to cope with the realities of an alien existence. So and then he turned to my friend, Dave, the intelligence officer, and he said to Dave, and I tell you, Dave, if you want a career in the Air Force, you just keep your mouth shut about UFOs. And Dave honored that warning for the rest of his career. He had more knowledge about the UFO mystery of any other person I've ever met, or ever talked to, or ever read about. And I begged him to write a book about it when he retired, and he never would.
How many years were you in contact with Dave?
I was in contact with him until about 4 or 5 years ago. He was very ill in the last several years. He died about 3 years ago. But I kept in contact about once a year. I'd call him and he'd tell me about different things that were going on. And he had a wealth of information about the UFOs. And he told me something I think that might interest you, Grant, is that at the very beginning, no one perceived the UFOs as a threat because they were just up there in the sky. They're probably our technology, a German technology, or American, one thing or another. No one perceived anything rockets or UFOs as alien. That was not a concept that we had. When I mentioned to you that when I was in the prison camp along with hundreds of other Allied airmen.
When was this? You're talking
1944.
1944. Okay.
After I had been shot down and I was sent to this prison camp, and here we're on a hot July day, and somebody rushes in and he says, hey, there's a rocket up in the sky. So we all ran outside and we looked up, and there's hundreds of us. We're all Allied airmen. We were trained in aircraft recognition. We looked up and we saw this huge red rocket flying at very high speed, at very high and at great height. It had no wings, it had no propellers, and it was silent. Obviously, not a conventional military aircraft. But not one of us ever associated it with alien technology. We assumed it had to be German, but until somebody mentioned, well, he wasn't sure about that. He said because it's flying from east to west, from Russia to Germany, and the Russians had no such technology. So we didn't discuss it any further. It was just probably technology that Germans or somebody else, maybe the Americans, this type of thing, I'd forgotten about, because nobody at that time in the early part of the war ever associated UFOs with aliens. Then the Foo Fighters, the same thing. You've heard of the Foo Fighters.
Did you have any experiences with pilots who had seen Foo Fighters?
Yes, Grant, I did. In my hut, there were several fighter pilots who had been shot down, Spitfire pilots. And above me, in my bunk, was Ron, the young Spitfire pilot, who was telling me about his experience with the Foo Fighters. He was flying on a patrol over France. And he says, on this day, 2 of these Foo Fighters, call them Foo Fighters, came and flew alongside on each wing, very close by. And he said at first he was very frightened and sort of felt threatened by these things because he had never seen them before, never heard about them before either. But he says they flew next to him at the same speed, he said, for about 10 minutes. And they took no hostile action against his Spitfire. And so he relaxed and just watched them. Then after about 10 minutes, they flew away. So when he got back to the base, he met up with the squadron officer, commander and the intelligence officer, and for debriefing, and he told them about this particular experience. And he was telling me about this. He says, and here was the debriefing officer, he says, listening, we're looking up at the ceiling with a silly smirk on his face, quoting Ron, with obviously in total disbelief of what this young pilot was talking about. And so he says, I realized that this man didn't believe a word he said. Nobody believed in anything of an alien nature. It might have been German, but alien, never. Never discussed that. But he says, I learned my lesson. So later on, he said, I had the same experience on 2 other occasions when I had Foo Fighters come within fairly close to my aircraft. I never reported them again. And he says, I know, and you can talk to other Spitfire pilots here, Hurricane pilots, and they'll tell you the same thing. He says, you'll learn to keep your mouth shut. Just like the base commander telling me, Fulham, nothing happened last night, you keep your mouth shut. Why is this? Well, it goes back to 1956, when the government, the American government, passed a very secret legislation trying to control the dissemination and information relating to UFOs with very severe penalties. And that related particularly to military aircrew and to commercial aircrew. I don't know of anybody that was fined or went to jail. Those were the implications of it. But I do know and heard of crews or airmen whose careers were ended by speaking out about these matters when they were not supposed to. So sightings of UFOs have gone on for years. Every year there are thousands of sightings, and many of them are videotaped, this sort of thing. I don't think that the mystery is with the UFOs anymore. We know all about them. You yourself have seen them, experienced them along with Brian and many other people, and you've written about it, you've spoken about it, along with thousands of other people. We know quite a bit about UFOs. And there are wonderful videos of UFOs, so we have that. The mystery is really what the conspiracy of silence. Why do we have that conspiracy of silence? Now, according to Dave, was the most knowledgeable man that I've ever dealt with in dealing with this issue. He told me, he says that at the very beginning, Vice President Truman, that's when it first started, he was well aware of the UFO incidents they had with the British, for example, who wanted permission to do abductions and getting their permission and that sort of thing. But he, along with the American military, were very paranoid, although they knew that they had crashed UFOs. They knew that, they had bodies. But they were very concerned about what they didn't know, and they were still potentially a threat. So Truman set up a committee, which later became known, I think, as Majestic 12. And according to Dave, he says that they were very paranoid after the war because they had lost all their top secrets dealing with their nuclear bombs. They had lost all the top secrets dealing with the Philadelphia experiment, which was the most was the most highly graded classification, secret classification was given to any project in the United States. They lost all of that. But they lost it to people like Julius Rose and his wife, who happened to be Jewish people. They had very serious distrust of Oppenheimer, Telfer, and other Jewish scientists. So there was that sort of paranoia about that we don't trust these civilians type thing. And Dave was telling me, he says, so when Truman set up the committee, he had the vice president, he had the chairman of the chief of staff, he had the director of the FBI, the director of the CIA, and the rest were civilian scientists. He said the American military never trusted them and didn't want them there. So what he did, he says, whenever they had a meeting, which was generally in the chief of defense staff's office, they would just forget to invite the civilian scientists. It didn't take long before they got the message. They were not wanted. So they pushed them out. Then the FBI was gradually pushed sidetracked. Then the CIA was there for a number of years, but only on a need-to-know basis. They weren't. So then it became purely a military thing. And then reached the point where even the president and vice president were left aside. And they, as President Carter could tell you, would only get information if it suited the UFO cabal's interest to tell them. There was a great deal more to it than that, and according to Dave, he told me that it not only worked from the top down, it worked from the bottom up. And he was telling me, because I'm pretty sure he had been to it, there were 3 officers from NORAD who were invited to Area 51 to see what was going on there. I'm pretty sure he was one of them. He had seen UFOs and that sort of thing. I knew that. But he says that what they did in the UFO cabal, they worked in compartments. There were 4 major compartments. It was compartmentalized. So no one knew what everybody else was doing. He only knew what his own section was doing. But above them was this figure he called Matrix, the controller. He had all the information, but he would only pass on information to the chief of the defense staff that he thought was suitable for him to know. That's just how much control there was to the processes that was going on about whatever was happening at the UFO cabal. I thought that was a very, very interesting statement to make, because there is where the mystery is. What's going on there? I've heard many different theories, and I think this is what we got to get at. We simply have got to find out what they know and tell us, so that we best deal with it, because I think we're at a very critical time.
Okay. And lastly, before we talk to Brian, can you tell me about your experience talking to Dave's son?
Yeah. I always call Dave about once a year. We talk usually about these things, about UFOs, one thing or another. He was a wealth of information for me, and I've always respected the fact that he took me into confidence. And he told me a great many things that he never told anybody else, because he knew I would respect his confidentiality. I called him a few years ago, about 8-10 years ago, and he was away. And his son answered the phone. Well, let's call him Tom. And I talked to him, and I was telling him about, the great relationship I had with his father, a great friend. We discussed and worked with UFOs and all this sort of thing, and NORAD and this sort of thing. And I was getting just a lot of silence. He wasn't reacting at all, and I thought he was just being a very unfriendly person. And so I didn't get very far with him. However, a couple of weeks later, when Dave got back, he called me. And I could see that, I could sense that he was a bit peeved with me. And then I realized what it was all about, because I had talked to his son and mentioned to his son about all the things that we were involved in with UFOs, one thing or another. Then he told me he had never ever discussed any of this with his family. I thought about it. I thought, there's nothing so strange about it. I've hardly mentioned a word of my experience in my own family. For example, when I was first shot down and I was taken by the German army, and my flight engineer and myself, they were going to put us up before a firing squad. Fortunately, about 5 o'clock in the morning, the Air Force came along and picked us up and took us away. Hadn't been for that, we would have been up for a fire squad. It was a terrible night to go through. There's that, plus other things that I've experienced. I've never ever mentioned it to my family. I thought about Dave, and I thought, yeah, I'm not quite sure why we don't discuss it. In this case, I think he had some concern about the risks involved in this matter, because he did say to me one time, when I asked him about writing the book, he said no, he didn't think he would do that. He says, because there are risks in doing that kind of a thing. People have been murdered. And he says, especially where the information may impact upon national security. So no, he didn't think that he would ever write a book. He never did. So he died with all of his information. It's a fascinating, fascinating world out there,
Yeah.
believe me.